please, with an explanation on that how that program was phased out with a little more specifics and timeline. The committee would appreciate it.
Happy to send the committee a brief.
Thank you. Mr. Desjardins, I'm going to need unanimous consent for you to ask a question. We are. Oh yeah. Okay.
It's actually in addition to your request for documents.
Yes.
If we can also include in the request for that update in writing a request for an update in the department's response to the Auditor General's point made in 2.34 related to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, that the Auditor General found that the ministry in cooperation with CMHC underfunded the Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba region by using outdated and old formulas.
Would that be possible, Ms. Wilson?
I can't promise for CMHC.
Oh.
In terms of the department's response.
If the question is about what data we use in terms of appropriating funds, we use current census data.
Yes.
You use current census data in this regard?
Yes.
Okay, sure. That would be good if you can supply that. But I understand that this portion of the agreement speaks directly to CMHC in cooperation with ISC.
I don't believe so. I believe
There's
it's
no
about how
cooperation
each department appropriates their funds, and for ISC we appropriate against current census data 2021.
And so this is not, you're saying this is not your problem?
I'm saying there's two parties to ask that question to.
And you have no responsibility for it?
I have a responsibility for ISC funding, which we use 2021.
All right. No,
so in this regard, none.
All right. Could you do your best if there's an aspect that you're responsible for? If you
just do something about it. My God.
We'd be happy to provide a funding history of how we appropriate funds.
Can you talk to CMHC at least?
All right, Mr. Desjardins, we'll get a response, and then we'll take next steps. I would thank the minister, but she's already left. That's very, very unusual. Order, Mr. Desjardins. I would thank the minister.
Kinds of answers, Chair.
Sorry. Let's get the answer back, and then this committee can take steps if you're not satisfied with it. But
I'm not satisfied. They're not doing it.
We're well over.
It's someone's problem.
Mr. Desjardins, I'm granting you extra time. I allowed it back and forth.
And I appreciate that, Chair. It's
not against you. We're going to get an answer. We will see what they respond, and then this committee can take it up again. Again, you have my commitment on that we will look at it and act if necessary.
Thank you, Chair.
Very good. Again, the minister's left already, very, very unusual. So I'll thank the officials. I'm sorry the minister is so busy. She had to rush out before we conclude our business. I will suspend this meeting, and we'll call on the next minister within a minute. The minister and other witnesses could take their seats, please. I'm going to welcome everyone back. And to switch gears, conformément à l'article 108.3G.
In accordance with Standing Order 108.3G, the committee resumes consideration of Report 1, ArriveCan, referred to the committee on Monday, February 12, 2024.
Witness, the Honourable Bill Blair, PC, MP, Minister of National Defence. Thank you for coming in today. We appreciate it. And your officials from the Department of National Defence. We have Stephanie Beck, Deputy Minister. Ms. Beck, is this your first committee appearance as a Deputy Minister?
Not as Deputy Minister, but as Deputy Minister of National Defence. It's day 4.
Very good. Well, welcome. This will be a good run through, because I'm sure you'll be at National Defence soon enough. So very good, and congratulations on the appointment. Troy Crosby, Assistant Deputy Minister, Materials Group, and Isabelle Desmarty, Assistant Deputy Minister, Human Resources Civilian. Mr. Blair, you have 5 minutes opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the kind invitation to come and appear before this committee. As you've already noted, I am joined by our new Deputy Minister of National Defence, who was previously a Deputy Minister at Agriculture, but Ms. Stephanie Beck and the others, and I won't repeat them because you've done so. First of all, if I may, I'd like to be clear with members of this committee that while I have the benefit of excellent and regular briefings from these senior officials with me today, I have had no direct involvement in the matters that this committee is studying. Hiring decisions and the administration of the public service is rightly the responsibility of the Deputy Minister. Ministerial intervention in this area is both inappropriate and wrong. However, each of us takes the issue of transparency and ethical conduct in government contracting very seriously, as does every single person at the Department of National Defence. We know that every dollar counts, especially when it comes to protecting Canada and Canadians. and that Canadians expect all of us to use their hard-earned money wisely. I'd like to spend the next few minutes highlighting the rules, expectations, and processes that are in place to ensure that we're meeting the highest standards possible when we contract outside the department. The defence team is made up of a dedicated group of people who are responsible for protecting Canada and Canadians, as well as advancing Canadian interests around the world. To support their critical work, our department will sometimes seek third-party expertise from outside contracting firms. And in these types of contracts, and indeed in all procurements, the department must follow Canadian laws and policies to the letter. Procurements must be conducted in a fair, open, and transparent manner in accordance with Treasury Board policies, as well as regulations, guidelines, trade agreements, and procedures. We recognize the importance of the competitive contracting process. 95% of all contracts awarded by the department over the past 3 years were awarded competitively. However, in some limited cases, including for some lower value contracts, the department will occasionally procure goods and services through a non-competitive process in order to deliver results quickly. In all cases, we ensure contracts are awarded transparently and achieve expected results, delivering value for money. We also have defense ethics training available to all employees at the Department of National Defense, and as with all departments, we are obligated to publicly disclose all contracts over $10,000 on the Open Government portal. Likewise, we expect all defense team members and all third-party organizations to follow the highest ethical standards as they carry out their duties. All employees are made aware of their responsibilities surrounding conflicts of interest and the Values and Ethics Code for the public sector as soon as they begin their tenure with the department. It is the obligation of employees to prevent, identify, disclose, and manage any outside activities that may constitute a conflict of interest within 60 days of their hiring. And while there is no specific policy against contracting for services with current and former employees and CAF members, these contracts must be disclosed at the time of hiring and conducted in an open, fair, and transparent manner to ensure that they are free of any real or perceived conflict. To improve our processes around how employees publicly disclose potential conflicts of interest, the Deputy Minister has advised me that D&D is now rolling out a mandatory two-step screening process for all incoming employees this month. The first step requires a new hire to sign a mandatory affirmation in their letter of offer. This affirmation includes a series of questions to determine whether a conflict of interest could exist. If an employee answers yes to any of these questions, they are expected to provide a full declaration in a confidential report to the Review Services Branch within 30 days. The department will then investigate the situation to analyze and manage the conflict of interest risk. We're also piloting new mandatory conflict of interest questionnaire for existing employees. Last month, this questionnaire was sent to 292 of our procurement members of the Ministerial group for completion. It will be expanded across the defense team in the coming weeks. While these new processes were not in place when Mr. Yeo was hired, he was still obligated to disclose any potential conflict of interest within 60 days of beginning his employment in the department. National Defense only received his declaration on March 3rd, which was 165 days into his tenure, and after he was suspended from his position. He subsequently resigned from the Federal Public Service 1 day before he was to discuss his employment with D&D. And following the issues around his appointment coming to light, both the Public Service Commission and the National Defense have completed investigations into his employment. Neither of these investigations have suggested error, favoritism, or improper conduct related to the hiring process. However, we're committed to applying lessons learned from this incident to improve our conflict of interest processes, to strengthen our approach to contracting national defense and across the entire public service. I want to assure the members of this committee we take any real or potential conflicts of interest at national defense very seriously. My expectation as minister is that all actions that take place in my department will meet the highest ethical standards. And we know the Canadians expect openness, transparency, and accountability from their government. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Sure. Open our first round. The first four members will each have 6 minutes each. Mr. January, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Minister, this week's Auditor General reveals how much Liberals love McKinsey, but especially those at National Defense. National Defense gave 15 contracts to McKinsey, 13 of which were non-competitive. In addition to breaking all kinds of rules, these contracts have gone to a company that is simultaneously working with the militaries of our strategic adversaries. Did you ever inquire about which other militaries McKinsey is working for around the world?
And again, as I've already indicated, officials perhaps could give you that information. I am not involved in the contracting process, but I would like to share with you.
Sir, if I can just clarify, it was a very specific question about actions you've taken as minister. Have you ever inquired? The McKinsey story has been in the news, right? You will have seen it. Did you ever inquire about which other militaries McKinsey is working for at the same time as working for the Canadian Department of National Defence?
Thank you. And with respect to the steps that I've taken, I'm happy to share with you. We've reduced the government use of professional services by 15% since I've taken over. We've ended the standing offers with McKinsey and all similar companies, and we've introduced stricter requirements for departments to make suppliers more transparent and accountable.
Okay, Minister, that wasn't the question.
I've never engaged with anyone from McKinsey. I've never talked to anyone there.
Okay.
And so I haven't got the information you seek, but one of my colleagues, perhaps Mr. Crosby, might have that information.
Have you ever asked your officials or sought information about which other militaries around the world McKinsey works for?
No.
Okay. Do you think you should have? Do you think that's important information? Do you think that's germane to the fact that they're also working for the Canadian Armed Forces?
My expectation is that our very professional and capable public service and people responsible for the procurement of these contracts would exercise due diligence in ensuring that with whomever we contract with meet our ethical and security requirements.
Well, can either of the public officials answer here? Very briefly, has the Department of Defense ever gotten information from McKinsey regarding which other militaries they're working with around the world? It's just a yes or a no.
Mr. Chair, the way we approach this is not to inquire what other work they have necessarily, but to ensure that the companies meet the security requirements checklist.
Okay, so the answer is no.
We don't go and pursue what other business they have. It's a large multinational. We ensure that they have the right.
Okay, yeah. So
contracts.
I guess this is a policy question, and it comes back to you, Minister, who's responsible for the direction here. When McKinsey has done particularly well from this government, but overwhelmingly from national defense, 13 non-competitive contracts, we've seen the Auditor General's report that McKinsey has been favored by this government significantly. At the same time, we know, in a limited way, not fully, but we know that McKinsey is engaged actively with our strategic adversaries around the world. That doesn't mean that they're sharing specific privileged information, but they're learning things from us that those same associates are applying in their interactions with foreign militaries. At a policy level, do you think this is good policy to not make these inquiries?
I think it's very good policy that anyone contracting with the Canadian government and the Department of National Defence either in competitive process or through standing offers, that they be subject to and meet the rigorous security standards that we put in place.
But should those include inquiries into who else they're working for at the same time?
Well, frankly, if there was any indication in that security review and screen that is put in place that indicated that was a concern, my expectation that would be brought to light.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a fundamental concern, but I'll move.
Okay.
I think we've heard your position. You've heard mine. It's a policy disagreement, and Canadians can make their judgment about whether that's a problem. This committee's heard from Mr. Yao, employee at National Defence, at the same time as his company was getting contracts from the government. Our view is that, aside from the particular problems of his case, we don't think that it makes sense to have someone who is an employee of the government who is also being contracted out to for certain work. If they're an employee, the purpose of contracting out is that the skills to do that activity don't exist within government. So why would you contract out to someone who's also a government employee? Which is why we put forward a motion to this committee that was passed, though opposed by the Liberal members, that was passed, calling on the government to end any of these double-dipping arrangements where a government employee is also a recipient of government contracts. Do you believe that the Department of National Defence should end all instances of double-dipping?
Perhaps you're not aware that a significant number of the members of the Canadian Armed Forces are reservists. by the very definition of their work, they are also employed in other occupations. Some of them are police officers or firemen. Some of them
Okay,
are
so
electricians.
let's set
technicians.
aside the reservist question, because I think that there's
That's
a particular
That's a
situation there.
situation where they are both.
Yeah, so I
employed by
have
the
limited time.
Department-
Let's set that aside. I
Government
understand that
Canada.
there's a particular case there of reservists, people that are full-time employees of your department, and also benefits of contract. Do we think we should end? We should end all double dipping in those cases?
Well, I think what we should do is ensure that all of the rules with respect to the declaration of conflict of interest are clearly articulated, and that appropriate measures are put in place to eliminate those
But if you have a
conflicts.
declaration and
Brief
the
question,
conflict
Mr.
of interest
Generous.
persists, declaring something doesn't change that there's a conflict of interest. If the conflict of interest persists, why don't we just end the conflict of interest by ending double dipping?
And respectfully, there's a spectrum of potential conflicts of interest. Some of those risks can be mitigated. Some of them require a full screen. Some of them would be an absolute prohibition from engaging in any contracts with the department. So it's a range. It really depends on the position the person holds and the services that they may be providing. There is an appropriate response. I am absolutely concerned that in this case, this individual did not meet those screening requirements. We've put some very rigorous steps in place in direct response to the recommendations of the Auditor General to make sure that that does not happen again. And when it came
Thank
to
you,
light,
Minister. I'm afraid that is the time.
Yeah,
I allowed
thank you, Mr.
extra
Chair.
time for you. You answered. Turning now to Ms. Khalid. You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. I'll start just to clarify, Mr. Crosby, how many contracts do you have with McKinsey currently?
We have no active contracts with McKinsey at this time.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Now, Minister Blair, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. And I realize that you were not the minister for this while during the active dates that we're discussing today. But Minister, during his testimony, Conservative card-carrying member Mr. Yao had a lot of interesting stories about what he did both as a member of the Canadian Armed Forces and when he was a contractor while he was flashing his Conservative badge to all of us here. To the best of your knowledge, can you please clarify exactly what he did during his time at National Defence?
If I may clarify one point, I was in fact the Minister of Defence when the Auditor General report came to light and through the work of parliamentary committees. Within 24 hours of that information becoming known, Mr. Yao was suspended and steps were being taken to deal with his employment. He resigned before that could be completed, but he was suspended and out of the building within 24 hours of that information coming to light, and I was, in fact, the minister at that time.
So to clarify, when you became aware of the accusations made against Mr. Yao, you took steps right away.
Well, in fairness, the Deputy Minister took the steps. Deputy Minister Matthews at that time took those immediate steps because he is the department head and was responsible for those actions. I was advised of the actions that he took. I certainly supported it, it didn't require my authority for the Deputy Minister. The Deputy Minister acted very, very quickly and appropriately in this case.
Thank you for that, and I think we can all at this table agree that that the specific case of Mr. Yao should not have happened at all. So since that incident has happened, have there been any steps that you or your Deputy Minister have taken to prevent these types of actions from happening in the future?
Yes, ma'am. And there are a number of, I think, very important steps that we've taken. We've introduced much stricter requirements around suppliers being much more transparent. As I've said, we're strengthening our conflict of interest code for public servants. We've taken very seriously the Auditor General's reports, and we're putting into action some of the recommendations that we've put. I've already articulated that the questionnaire, the new questionnaire that's being provided. If the answer is yes to any of the 6 questions put to a new employee, they must submit a more detailed conflict of interest statement within 30 days. But we're also, and I think this is important, we're strengthening the training for our officials. Sometimes the regimes around conflict of interest are not always well understood. And so we're strengthening the training for our officials so that they'll be able to more readily comply with the requirements and the expectation of all Canadians, but also for management personnel so that they would, be more alert to some of the challenges, the steps that could be taken to mitigate any potential conflict, and how to make sure that we are maintaining and protecting the integrity of our procurement processes, our businesses within our departments as well.
I think that's so important. I mean, when we talk about taxpayer dollars, we have to maintain the utmost respect for every single penny that we spend as a government or as parliamentarians as well. So I really appreciate that. Deputy Beck, you're new to your current role. Congratulations on taking it up. But you're not new to the world of D&D. You previously served as the Associate Deputy Minister, is that correct? Yep. So I wanted to give you a chance to explain how you will ensure compliance with ethics and conflict of interest regime for public servants within your department.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And what I would like to stress is how much I plan to build on the excellent work done by my predecessors, notably just in the past few months and weeks. And in addition to what the minister has outlined with some very new proposals around the code of conflict and a requirement within a certain time frame for new employees to respond, we're also creating a new oversight committee of procurement that will have a much more detailed and deliberate review of every contract that is over a certain amount. And of course, the training that the minister referred to. At the moment, what we have is a process whereby staff are trained before they get there, for instance, their financial delegation. This tends to be at a moment in time. What we're looking at for the future is a more regular, routine, repetitive set of training requirements rather than a one-off, and then we just hope that the person continues to deliver as they should.
I appreciate that, and I realize that the majority of our public service are very honorable people, and they work very, very hard to take care of Canadians, and especially during the pandemic, we saw just how much they went above and beyond. So, where I say that, I also want to kind of dive a little bit deeper into holding people to account.
Ms. Cleary, I'm afraid the dialogue will be a brief question. You're almost out of time.
How would you hold public servants to account if they find themselves with a conflict of interest?
When such conflicts arise, it is incumbent upon the member themselves in order to declare that conflict. And if they have failed to meet the standards, I think there has to be high levels of accountability. I think Canadians expect that of us. I've always been very mindful. I've had a number of jobs in my life where I've been responsible for spending the public's money. And I always thought it was incumbent upon us to make sure that we be as transparent and open with them to ensure that they're getting good value. And when there are issues where someone does not follow the rules, there has to be consequences.
Thank you.
Serious and public.
Thank you, Minister. Suivant, c'est Madame Sécla Desgaillés. Vous avez la parole pour 6 minutes.
Hello, Mr. Minister. Thank you for having accepted our invitation. Could you give me the date that Mr. Yeo quit his job?
And, I may turn to one of our officials, but I believe it was March of this year. As I said, he was suspended immediately. Excuse me, and I have Isabel with me. It was March 5th. But he was suspended immediately, become this information. He was scheduled to come in to deal with his employment, and he resigned on March 5th.
Par contre,
Thank you. I understand that after there was media reports and the Auditor General report was on February 7th. It took a month before he quit. But what I'm trying to specify here is you were minister when Mr. Yeo was hired. When Mr. Yeo was hired, he was working for the public service, working for D&D, and he came before the AUGO committee, the government operations. He testified as he was an employee of National Defense. He was testifying on Dalian. He was there as the CEO for Dalian, and he was also a civil servant. So, I mean, here's a question with regards to different departments that where you've worked. At what frequency were you discussing, Mr. Sofsky? During this period of the RFCAN audit, but during the period where you were Minister for Public Safety and Mr. Osevsky was president of the agency, how often did you discuss?
Fréquence, pardon.
I had a number of discussions with the president of CBSA at that time, but as I hope as I made clear in my opening remarks, I was not in any way involved in any of the HR practices, the hiring or firing of employees. That is the responsibility of the deputy minister or deputy minister head of their organization. And similarly, I was not involved in the issuance of any contracts with, because when in my ministerial position.
Simplement,
So what is relevant here is that it's not just one thing that went badly. There are many things successive things that went badly at DND, and we tell ourselves, well, there's a responsibility for deputy ministers, for employers that are civil servants, but there's also departmental responsibility, accountability, and that's up to you. And you were Minister of Public Safety as well, and everything that happened under RFCAN when you were Minister for Public Safety, and there was CBSA, and it's your accountability that is in question. Now, as to the frequency of contacts that you had with Mr. Sofsky, this brings me to wonder, are you aware or have you talked about issues? The alerts that were saying that there were issues at CBSA, there was a whistleblower that were talking about a generalized corruption where you're minister. Did you hear about these allegations as to a whistleblower? No. An important element is that Butler submitted his official complaint in September 2021, and you were still Minister at Public Safety in September 2021. Did Mr. Sofsky or did anyone from CBSA inform on the minister responsible on this complaint mentioned by Butler?
Your question is no. I would point out that we were in what is often referred to as a caretaker convention because the election campaign and the writ had been dropped in September of 2021. But however, I did not have any conversation. I was throughout that entire period of time the Minister of Public Safety, but I did not have any conversation with the president of CBSA, Mr. Ozowski, during that period of time with respect to that issue.
mais sachant que vous êtes ministre responsable, ne croyez-vous pas?
But knowing that you were the minister responsible, and thank you for your direct answers, but don't you think that the minister responsible normally should be aware when important complaints, especially when you have whistleblower complaints? There was Mr. Savoy with issues with CBSA. His pension wasn't paid for years, whether it be Butler complaining about CBSA. Don't you think that a minister should be aware of this type of information? And I'm asking this question truly as a veteran minister, if I can say that, an experienced minister. Don't you think it should be ministerial responsibility of a minister?
First of all, I am not the deputy lead of CBSA. That was, in fact, Mr. Osowski, and that was it was his job. However, let me be very clear as well, as a rather senior minister of government, my expectation is I am always responsible what takes place within the organizations or agencies under my ministerial authority, but I don't have authority with respect to personnel matters that you've referred to, and unfortunately at that time that information was not brought to my attention.
Parce que justement, comme membre senior de votre gouvernement, c'est...
So it's one thing that we're seeing now. We're seeing this throughout the government, and it's really a shame. We see the same thing with sustainable technology. The government seems to be losing control of agencies, losing control about what's happening fundamentally within departments. And we're wondering if the ministers even know what's happening on a daily basis within their departments. And this is throughout. And at DND, according to the AG report, 50% of true conflicts of interest that were found by the Auditor General, 50% are coming from the Department of Defense. And you mentioned many different issues on conflict of interest and regulations, but this is quite a disastrous observation for DND. So what do you think about this last report? And if we're talking about McKinsey in particular.
Well, first of all, I have never as a minister of government, ever directed anyone or authorized anyone to disobey the rules, the very strong and rigorous and appropriate and necessary rules that are in place for the conduct of the business of each of our departments. But when the Auditor General does her very important work in identifying deficiencies in the way that work is being done, it is the responsibility of the minister, in this case, to ensure that the departments respond in an appropriate way. And as I've already articulated, I won't waste the committee's time by going over it again.
Thank
but
you.
we listen very carefully. You're welcome, sir. We listen very carefully to the auditor's report, and we've taken action in response to the deficiencies that she identified, which I think is my responsibility, and I've shared with this committee that we have acted.
Thank you, Minister. I wanted to allow for a fulsome response to that question. Mr. Desjardins, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I do want to thank the Minister for being present with us today on what is a really important issue. Several audits now in the Public Accounts Committee have come forward, not just in ArriveCan, but more recently in the McKinsey study that looked at the very large issue of contracting, subcontracting, this shadow network of consultants that are like bugs to a rotting meal in so many ways, that they're in this environment continuously seeking contracts from the government, and at many times even create massive networks that become layers of subcontractors, layers and layers and layers. And multiple reports, including the ArriveCan study presented by the Auditor General, suggest that this network has largely been able to, one, take advantage of the PSPC rules, and in some instances there was many cases actually where there was the awarding of non-competitive contracts. In your ministry, there has been instances of non-competitive contracts being issued at very large sums. Why would your ministry, in any case, look towards non-competitive contracts?
There are some limited circumstances, and as I've said, 95% of all of the contracts we've signed at D&D are done through a competitive process. But it is the nature of, frankly, the work that we do at Department of National Defense that there are occasions when there are very limited options and there's some urgency to signing contracts. And at the same time, that does not abrogate the responsibility to follow the rules and to be open and transparent. But there are some very limited circumstances where a non-competitive process is the appropriate way to get done what is required.
No, I appreciate that. But you would have to also accept that same truth to be a truth of having to accept the inherent risk of doing a non-competitive contract, correct?
Well, and there is inherent risk, but I think risk has to be managed, and it has to be managed through rigorous adherence
And that
to the
brings me to my
policies
next
and processes
question.
that are put in place.
If in fact there is risk present, what checks and balances can you, internal checks and balances, especially in regards to the ArriveCan situation, does your ministry undertake, or if any?
Well, and if I may, I think I've actually spent some time going over some of the things that we do and the things that we put in place. I may, because I've got an incredibly experienced procurement minister, perhaps turn to Troy.
Maybe actually before you answer, if you can also answer one more question, because I know you've been here before, Mr. Cosby, on some of this. In relation to the Auditor General's report, it suggests that some of these contracts, to which I hope you can comment on, were also susceptible to security breaches. Are you aware of the Auditor General's report in regards to security breaches? And has the ministry done any work to review any potential breaches, security breaches, pertaining to any contract, including competitive ones?
Two answers for
Yeah,
you,
please.
the committee. On work that's been done most recently, and this is coming out of reviews by the Office of the Procurement Ombudsman, by our internal review services, and most recently by the Auditor General, is strengthening our contract compliance framework. To begin with, the best way to mitigate risk here is to plan well in advance and ensure that we have the time to put the right processes and procedures in place. So there's a planning element to this. Then there's sampling to make sure that we're looking across the contracting that we're doing. The Department of National Defense, in any given fiscal year, issues in the order of 145,000 contracts. So there's a sampling approach to do this. We have a way of looking at higher risk contracts to ensure that we're looking across the board, plus some random sampling. And then there's reporting and governance on the performance against those reviews so that we're continuously learning. So we're strengthening that contract compliance framework and building out the team now so that we can, in light of what we've learned, ensure that we're going to incorporate those lessons into our policies, our procedures, and our training.
What about in addition to those enhancements to have a more strenuous and better internal checks on these contracts? Has at any point in the discussions you've had, particularly to Minister Blair, with cabinet officials or other members to actually look at hiring more public servants? You know, we've seen in the Auditor General's report on ArriveCan that there's a savings of 6 to 1, that in some instances that there were contracts given to private firms where that work could have been done by the public service. And that probably hurts a lot of folks in our public service who know that they have the skills and they want to do the work, but it takes the Auditor General to confirm that truth. And to that point, will you confirm or commit to the fact that public servants should be doing the work and you should just reduce the expenditure on private contracting? And I'll make one last point before you can respond. I had your former Deputy Minister here, Bill Matthews, present, and they spent a whopping $5.1 billion in contracting last year. That's almost double. That is more than double what you pay the public service. Like, what explanations can you have for Canadians that are concerned about their security, concerned about work by the public service, and taxpayer savings?
Thank you very much. And I think they're important questions. I've already acknowledged. I think we have an extraordinary professional public service, and I very much value their work.
Why not give them the work?
Well, and if I may, some of the professional contracts that Mr. Matthews shared with this committee or a committee previously, some of those contracts are for services, for example, the maintenance of certain vehicles or ships or planes. The public service does not have the capability.
Why not?
Well, but again, I think it's appropriate to find the best way, the most cost-effective way of getting the job done. And there are.
This is not the most cost-effective way, Mr. Blair. With all due respect, it's costing twice the cost of the public service.
Well, and again, the public service may not have the capability, and I suppose we could.
You're talking about repairing vehicles. I think they can.
And gentlemen, however, that is the time. I'm going to move on, begin the second round. Mr. Brock, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Minister Blair, welcome. Minister, do you know how much the Department of National Defense spends on management consulting contracts last year?
I don't have that number available to me, but I've got some pretty good people who may have that information. Brian?
Approximately $73 million.
That's correct. It's exactly $73 million. We asked your department to furnish us with details, and that's the response that we got. $73 million when men and women of our services are couch surfing, lining up at food banks, money not spent on boots, money not spent on equipment. There is indeed a morale crisis with our service personnel. And to make matters worse, we learned that Canada, at any given point in time, has enough ammunition to last about 3 days. Does that concern you, Minister?
Yeah, of course. As a matter of fact,
should.
and I would refer you to the new defense policy update, Our North Strong and Free, that I just released, where we actually articulated those concerns and the investments that we needed to make. And by the way, the money to do that, to invest in for example, ammunition production and provide the money for long-term contracts is in that document, but it's also in the 2024 budget.
Thank you.
And so
Thank you, Minister. I got to move on. My
concern.
time is very limited. I appreciate your response. So I got a list of all these middlemen contractors. These are contractors who are retained by the Government of Canada to ultimately hire professionals. And surprisingly, one of the entries is from SNC-Lavalin, the company that was mired in controversy not too long ago, facing bribery, corruption, and fraud charges, ultimately put pressure so much on the Prime Minister and his staff that would lead to another conviction of ethical violations. They would be probably the last person the Government of Canada would want to align itself with, yet SNC-Lavalin got $115,000. So the question is very simple. Why did taxpayer monies of $115,000 go to this company?
Well, and again, I don't know that particular contract, and I don't know whether my officials would have that information, but I'd invite them to provide it if you require it.
Officials?
I don't have the details on that contract.
What
and
did
I'm
SNC-Lavalin do?
Not
You don't have details?
sure,
To
Mr.
provide us
Chair,
with details?
when the dates were, when that contract was in place.
Last year.
But we can look it up.
It was last year.
And as Troy mentioned, we're talking about an incredibly large number.
Yeah,
of
I gotta
contracts
move
that
on,
they-
Minister.
So
I
having the
appreciate
particular
that.
details of one of them.
I appreciate that. I'm looking at this list. It's roughly 3 pages. They're either corporations, limited corporations. The identity is pretty much explanatory as to what they do. Yet there is one entry for an individual by the name of Melanie Randall. Would she be a Liberal donor or affiliated with the Liberal Party of Canada?
Melanie Randall is.
Well, Melanie Randall received $137,812.49 of taxpayer funds. I know I certainly want to know, and I'm sure all Canadians want to know, why a certain individual has received a pretty significant contract. I'd like to know who she is, what she did for this government, and what value has Canadians received. You'll provide that to me, Mr. Crosby?
Yes, we can do that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Here's another big one. Pardon the pun, because the name is Big Rideau Leadership Services. Last year they got $14,000. Do you know what they did?
Not specifically, Mr. Chair.
Do you know where they work from?
I'm not specifically aware. I've heard of the name of the contractor before.
Well, we did a search, and Big Rideau Leadership Services works in a residential area just outside of Ottawa on 6 Brandy Creek Crescent, likely working out of their home office or basement, just like the infamous GC Strategies.
Point of order,
which-
Chair. I'm just concerned about personal information being given out about individuals. I don't know where this is going, but
Public domain.
you know, we know that Mr. Yeo was a conservative donor, but you know, I don't really see where
Point
this
of order
is
on
going.
that point of order, Chair.
Yes, Mr. Brock.
Okay. We're going to correct the record once and for all because both Ms. Shanahan and Ms. Khalid are misrepresenting the evidence that this
Point of
committee
order,
had
Chair.
heard.
That's
I've got the
really-
floor, Chair.
Point of order, Chair.
Got the
I'll
floor.
hear you in just 1 second.
Are both misrepresenting the evidence of Mr.
Chair,
Yao.
I'm sorry, I cannot
Mr.
allow
Yao
those kind of comments to stand,
presented
Chair.
a
My
donor
apologies,
card,
Chair, I
Okay,
can't
thank you.
let
not
those
a
comments to
membership
stand.
card
All right.
from the
Absolutely.
Conservative
Remember
Party
the
of Canada.
translators. Okay, thank you, Mr. Brock. You've made your point. Ms. Khalid, you have a point of order?
Not anymore, Chair.
Okay. So, Mr. Brock, you have just literally a few
I
seconds.
got one question left.
In a few seconds, so no preamble, please. Please ask
Yeah.
the question.
How many millions of taxpayer funds have been shoveled to consultants working out of their basement?
We don't shovel taxpayer dollars anywhere.
Paid out to consultants working out of their
that's an
basement.
entirely
Mr.
different
Brock, your time is up, and I heard a response from the minister, so I'm going to move to Ms. Shanahan for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And yes, moving to the topic at hand. Minister, you mentioned in your opening statements that some new actions around conflict of interest declaration and compliance processes have been put in place for new hires. Can you or your officials provide us with more details on when those measures will be rolled out across the department?
It's actually happening, thank you very much, Brenda. It's happening right now. The training for our public officials, for example, for the people that we already have on has, and I'm being told that the answer to this is on tab 4. The process of all are being applied, they're being rolled out this month, all right across the board, but we've already begun the training for our people to make sure that they're aware of the new rules and the expectation, and the mandatory affirmation requirement is going to be part of all future letter of offers. So we put those measures in place now. The work was done very quickly by the department because they have had the benefit of the Auditor General's recommendations, and I think they've responded quite appropriately to make sure that not only are we maintaining high ethical standards in these procurement processes, but that it can be done transparently to be able to assure Canadians that we're being careful with their money.
Well, thank you very much for that, Minister, because I think, yes, all members of this committee were definitely seized with the issue of conflict of interest in a, as it was a, we understood from the testimony that we heard that it was still common practice for members, including members of the Canadian Armed Forces, to do work in a private capacity as well as still working for the CAF. But it was certainly with the testimony, the very disturbing testimony that we heard from Mr. Yeo on so many different levels, that really shed a light on these practices and that they need to be tightened up. So when you say that these measures apply to CAF members, and in an earlier question you referred to reservists, could we have some clarity around, what kind of supervision or monitoring, if you will, because I understand that it can be quite fluid how members will move in and out of the CAF and the reserve forces.
It can be. We're really talking about making sure that those who are in a position of, for example, applying for contracts or approving contracts, understand the rules around conflict of interest. I think that's critically important. By the way, you asked for a date. In May, we actually sent out a new questionnaire to 292 of the procurement members within the Ministerial group under Mr. Crosby's leadership, to make sure that they're aware of the new requirements and new procedures. It's not unusual, for example, for members of the Canadian Armed Forces, particularly those who are serving in our reserves, to have other lines of employment. It's kind of the nature of employment these days. Many people have a number of different occupations or things
and would
that they're
that be,
pursuing.
Minister, because they have different specialties or
And
expertise?
that is possible. But what is never negotiable is where a conflict of interest exists, where someone may be in a decision-making position with respect to a contract. They should declare their conflict very clearly up front. We have, obviously, with Mr. Yeo, had circumstances where that was not followed and that was not done. And so we put some additional processes in place. We're now, for example, to every new hire, we're putting 6 questions to them about any potential conflict, not only for themselves, but for family members or any element of their occupation. If the answer is yes to any of those, that then triggers a next round of steps. It is the responsibility of the employee to declare a conflict, but we're making sure that they have all the information that they require and that the department can make good decisions with respect to managing the risk of any conflict. Some of those conflicts can be mitigated. Some of them have to be screened, and some of them would require a complete prohibition from the person having any engagement in these matters. We need to get that information from them, and we are prepared to take the steps. I think it's really important that we be able to demonstrate that we are acting quickly to respond to the concerns that the Auditor General has raised with us as well. I think there's some very important work taking place at Treasury Board, of which our department is part, but we're not solely part of it, that the government, through the Treasury Board, is also enacting a number of really important measures to ensure the integrity and the transparency of all of our procurement processes.
I'm afraid
thank
that
you
is
for
the
that,
time.
Minister.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Mrs. Sinclair Desgagnés. Thank you. Mr. Minister, when you talk about 95% of contracts are given in a non-competitive fashion, you're talking about 95% with regard to the total amount of contracts awarded or the number? So it is the amount or the number?
There, it's the exact opposite. 95% are awarded under a competitive process.
En termes de montant total ou en termes de nombre de contrats?
Total number or total amount?
D'accord.
I'm basing that on advice I just received.
Parfait. En termes de nombre de contrats?
Number of contracts. So when we look at the McKinsey report on the way that several contracts were awarded in a non-competitive way, we often see that the justification was in the case, for example, it was less than 40,000. However, what the Auditor General saw is that there was a practice that is more and more common at different departments, is that the first contract might be a small amount, but then there are several contracts afterwards, and the totals are quite large. The first contract, a value of 22,000, so we can say, okay, but then 3 subsequent contracts, and the total here for one service, $5 million, and this was done in a non-competitive way. So the rules were, they've gone around the rules by saying, oh, it's a small amount. Then several contracts were awarded to provide a service at $5 million. Can this type of practice continue at D&D?
Well, as I said in my earlier remarks, all of the standing offers with McKinsey and all other similar companies have been ended. And so those standing officers are concluded. We're not going to continue with that. With respect to the actual mechanics of the procurements that you've just spoken to, if I may, I would turn to my colleague, Mr. Crosby.
The scenario that you've described in your question is a possibility, and in some cases it's justified and genuine that work will reveal the requirement for additional work scope. But they are considered riskier procurements, and in our contract compliance oversight framework and with the oversight that we're putting in place, those types of contract expansion or continuations would be flagged and require additional oversight.
Brièvement, très brièvement.
Very briefly. Well, I don't have the time to start another question. Okay, thank you.
You have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Minister Blair, I want to describe to you and paint a picture of a scenario, and you tell me the logical solution to it. Now imagine there's an operable clinic that you're in charge of. At that clinic, let's say there's 5 healthcare professionals. Let's say those healthcare professionals are having a lot of work going on there. They're feeling like they may be undercompensated for their work. The solution to that, in some people's mind, may be to ensure that their working conditions are fair. But what if it became the recommendation of the person in charge of that place to actually hire a specialized group, another private company, to then hire other persons that could replace the job of that healthcare professional at a higher rate to fill the vacancy there? Wouldn't it be more logical in your mind to just better support the public servants that are working there now?
Yeah, let me be very clear. I'm in complete agreement that we need to ensure that we support the public service that do really important work for us.
You're saying that, Minister Blair, but the thing is, the situation I painted is a real situation happening under your watch. There are healthcare professionals on bases right now who are not being paid equitably or fairly. And the government's response is too bad, so sad. And then they've actually hired a contractor, Calian. Are you familiar with the company Calian?
I'm not.
Calian has been asked as a professional service finder to then look for replacement workers. Those replacement workers are taking the jobs of healthcare professionals that are already operating on base. Worse yet, they're getting paid at a higher rate, get paid more benefits, get paid over working holidays, and have far more access to a work-life balance than those who are in the public service. Don't you think that that's a disservice to the public service? So how can they take seriously your claim that you really value them when their jobs are being taken away, subcontracted away to Calian, who is now hiring public sector health workers, bringing them into the private system, and we're paying as taxpayers a premium?
Well,
how is that fair?
And first of all, Blake, I'm not familiar with the circumstances you described.
Well, maybe your officials are? It's a pretty large case.
Listen, give me that information and I'll look into it for you, because I think it's really important. First of all, I have a responsibility. Every member of the Canadian Armed Forces is exempt from the Canada Health Act. It is my responsibility to make sure that we provide them with adequate health care. And I want to make sure that we do that.
Can you commit to ending the contracting of private healthcare workers in our public, away from our public service?
I don't have that information right now. What I would do is, please share it with me, and I'll look into it.
Thank you. That
Certainly.
is the time for that round. Next up is Mr. Nader for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, Chair, thank you, Minister, for joining us here this afternoon. Just to quickly preempt the potential Liberal gotcha moment that they may want to share in their next round when they try to wave around David Yo's membership card. They would know that Mr. Yo's membership became disactive and non-active the moment he ran for a different political party. So just to try to preempt their gotcha moment, it ceased to be active once our party learned of his other party. But Chair, to Minister again, thank you for joining us. First, has the RCMP contacted you directly about the Arrive can? No. Thank you for that, Chair. When your cabinet colleague, Minister Anand, appeared before us on April 18th, she was very clear that it was the CBSA that was at fault for the Arrive can scandal and for the cost overruns. In fact, in a response to a question from Mr. Desjardins, she said, and I'm going to quote this, it was because the CBSA did not follow the rules. Do you agree with your cabinet colleague, Minister Anand, that the CBSA is the federal agency responsible for the cost overruns with the Arrive can scandal?
I haven't had the benefit of seeing the information that perhaps Minister Anand has, and so I'm unable to come to that conclusion in the absence of that information or evidence.
But you have read the report. You've read the Auditor General report. So would you agree that it was CBSA that was primarily responsible for the...
I would agree that there were very significant deficiencies in the control of those contracts. But actually determined that it wasn't as clear in the Auditor General's report that I read as to the assignment of responsibility or blame.
Okay, so you were the minister for a significant period of time as public safety minister, under which CBSA is responsible.
Yep.
Given the benefit of hindsight, and of course no one can predict the future, but given the benefit of hindsight, would you not agree that there were deficient processes at CBSA that allowed for this contract or allowed for this app to be developed at a significant cost over? And would you at least accept
well,
that?
And John, as I've tried to make clear earlier, when I was in that position, at no time did I ever authorize anyone in any of the agencies that I was responsible for as Minister of Public Safety to disobey the rules that were in place, and they're well-articulated rules with respect to how these contracts are to be managed. And at no time, unfortunately, was I made aware of the deficiencies that the Auditor General did a good job and brought forward. But I can also tell you that in reading that Auditor General report, we have fulfilled our responsibilities to act quickly to make sure that the deficiencies are properly addressed, that people are held to account, and that we put in place appropriate measures to make sure that that does not happen again.
Would you agree then perhaps that your officials failed at that point in time? Did Mr. Ozowski fail at that time in properly ensuring that the agency had proper controls in place?
And respectfully, I don't believe I have enough information available to me to determine exactly. But as I've already indicated, the responsibility is primarily that of the deputy head of an agency, and so there is a level of responsibility there. And as I've said as well, as the Minister of Public Safety, as I then was, I also have responsibility to ensure that when these deficiencies are identified, that we respond in an appropriate way, that people are held to account, and that steps are taken to ensure that we maintain the integrity of those procurement processes.
When was the first time you learned of the existence of the company GC Strategies?
When the Auditor General came out with a report. I was not, as I've already said, I'm not involved in any of our HR or procurement processes. I don't hire and I don't authorize or approve any of those contracts.
Were you aware prior to the Auditor General's report of the concept of ghost contracting? Were you aware of that?
No, sir.
Okay. In your opening comments, you made a comment about two investigations, and I just want you to clarify this, related to David Yo's employment and contracting. Am I correct in that there were two investigations?
That's the information that I understand from the former Deputy Minister.
And who undertook those investigations?
My understanding is that they were done within the department itself.
Okay. And would you be willing to share those investigations with this committee?
They're not my investigations. The department was doing an internal review of what had taken place in the processes. They investigated those matters.
So, but it was the Department of National Defense undertook those investigations. Would the Deputy Minister be in a position to confirm whether she could share those reports with this committee?
So if I could clarify, one of them, Public Service Commission, about the external hiring process, and similarly, a report on the hiring process from the perspective within the department.
Let me, your time, could those be shared with the committee?
I believe they can.
Thank you. We'll look for those. That's your time, Mr. Nader? Yeah.
You know, we also have responsibilities with respect to privacy interest in the maintaining the confidentiality of certain measures.
Yeah.
I'm sure the HR official would advise me of that.
Very good. It's now
Thanks.
over to Ms. Yip for the last 5-minute segment. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you. Minister Blair, it's always a pleasure to see a colleague from Scarborough. And congratulations to Ms. Beck on your new role. And I just want to clarify something from Mr. Nader regarding Mr. David Yo's Conservative Party membership. It appears that it is an annual membership and just renewed until May 31st, 2025. So it seems to me that it's still valid. So I'd like to now ask Mr. Crosby a question. I just would like to turn to the issue of contracting out work more broadly at D&D. How many contracts does D&D enter into an average year?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I mentioned earlier, it's in the average of 145,000 contracts a year.
How many of them are the result of an open competition?
As the minister was saying, from a volume or numbers perspective, it's about 95% that are competitive.
Right, and I believe that, Minister Blair, you also mentioned that 5% were non-competitive, and it was because contracts needed or work needed to be done quickly. Is that right?
Well, if I may, I think there can be a number of reasons, valid reasons why pursuing a non-competitive process. I think quite clearly our strong preference is that they would be competitive processes. But sometimes through time constraints, sometimes because there is only one source of a particular thing that might be required, we are, in those limited circumstances, frankly, the only practical way to acquire either the service or the material that we require is to pursue a sole source contract. But again, our strong preference is to follow a competitive process.
And if I could add, Minister, there are 4 exceptions documented in the government contract regulations. We adhere to those exceptions. As the minister mentioned, sometimes there's only one source of supply, oftentimes tied to the ownership of intellectual property that we have to respect. Other occasions, there could be an emergency requirement that played out during COVID where urgency is absolutely top of mind. But there are 4 documented government contract regulation exceptions to competition.
The committee was told last time that D&D spends almost $5 billion every year in contracts. Can you break that down for the committee?
I could break it down to an extent. The categories, and I think the minister mentioned it earlier, the spending that really represent the bulk of that money, the large dollar values, would be for very specialized activities. For instance, the design of our new fleets of ships for the Navy. That work is coded to professional services in our financial systems. Obviously very different to what would be considered management consulting, where earlier we had mentioned about a $73 million spend for activities also under professional services, but specific to management services.
So given how large the numbers are here, how do you assess value for money in these contracts?
Value for money, Mr. Chair, is on an individual contract by contract basis. Is the market rate that we're paying appropriate to the good or services that we're acquiring? For the most part, as just discussed, we ascertain that through competition, through market pressure. And in other cases, we work with our colleagues in PSPC, for instance, and we can make comparisons with what other clients, customers are paying for similar services or goods when there are sole source requirements because of, for instance, intellectual property limitations on the procurement strategy.
What happens if we are no longer getting value for money for these contracts? What are the next steps?
If, for example, Mr. Chair, the contractor isn't actually delivering the contracted service or good, the contracts will always have clauses within them where we could work either through PSPC or when we're operating within our own contracting authorities to terminate the contracts.
That is about the time, Ms. Yip. I want to thank Minister Blair and your officials for coming in from the Department of National Defence. We appreciate your time today. I'm going to suspend this meeting for 5 minutes to allow the witnesses and the minister to exit, and then people can just stretch their leg, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. This meeting is suspended.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.